Hello, we are going to be covering the state corporate crime in Chapter 6. This is one of my particularly favorite cartoons because you have a million signs that say public corporations out of public government, and of course the media is saying over here, once again, protesters have failed to get their message across. Basically what this means is that the media oftentimes sets the narrative for the country. And as such, despite the fact that most of us think that the marriage between state and federal government and how crime committed through corporations escalates as their relationship tightens. So let's talk about the definition. State corporate crime exists at the intersection of business conducted by government and corporations. So we have all these corporations that work with the government. Here's the government. And it's based on the idea that there is an interdependence between governments and corporations. Let me give you some examples. We have industrial fires, nuclear weapons production, oil spills, and this is one of the most famous oil spills of the last 10 years. This was the BP oil spill when their drilling mechanisms blew up. Treaty violations, and of course preemptive wars. Most people accuse George W. Bush of creating the war in Iraq to benefit multiple corporations that he was affiliated with. So there's a lot of dialogue, and whether or not it's true or not true is something that really won't be definitively identified probably till everybody is long gone and the classified information is finally released. Let's talk about a specific example. It's a California-based company called Unocal, which most of us know by their big 76 that they have on their oil tankers. They were complicit in the torture, rape, and murder of Burmese citizens by government soldiers who were helping the corporation build a gas pipeline. So in 2005, they settled a lawsuit, and it basically said, in a sense, that they understood that this stuff was all going on. They knew it was happening, but because the Burmese soldiers were helping them clear the land of not just the people, but whole villages, so they could build their pipeline, they were complicit, meaning they knew. They didn't necessarily do it themselves, but they knew about it. Then we have a very famous case from the 90s from ValueJet, which still is an airline today. In 1996, the Federal Aviation Administration was found to have failed to adequately enforce safety regulations after a ValueJet crashed in the Florida Everglades. The really sick part that they kept pushing all over the news was the fact that anybody who may have survived got eaten by alligators. So yeah, that was pretty much the thing that was all over the news in those days. Once the investigation was done, they discovered that an improperly inspected oxygen canister caused the plane to explode, killing all 110 people. This is not as a direct government corporate crime as the previous one with Unocal, but negligence in and of itself is also a crime, and especially when it is a government agency who is tasked with the oversight of a vehicle that literally could kill hundreds of people in one shot. Then we have a very famous situation that happened after Iraq was invaded back in 2002. A company was started in 2003 by a group of businessmen affiliated with George W. Bush, as well as George W. Bush's former campaign manager, Joe Alba. And that's Joe over here with the very nice hairstyle. The company was New Bridge Strategies, and it helped corporations obtain lucrative government contracts in Iraq. And again, this is shortly after the invasion. And, from the information that we've studied this semester, you can see how much money was made by certain companies during the Iraq War. When all was said and done, and, government went in and audited some of these contracts, they discovered that these corporations that Joe Alba had hooked up with George W. Bush's crew were overbilling and underproviding the services that were provided. I know you're shocked, but it did happen. So let's talk about globalization as a concept. This is a worldwide movement towards economic, financial, trade, and communications integration and interdependence. The world has become a giant game of dominoes. So what happens in one country can have a huge impact on other countries around the world. In 2008, in the United States, we had a terrible housing market crash. And when it crashed, it didn't just affect the United States, it affected the entire world, causing a worldwide recession that many countries are still trying to dig themselves out from under. We also have what we call crimes of globalization. Corporations often find moving to underdeveloped countries appealing because they have less regulations, less government oversight, abundant natural resources, and a very large labor pool that is poorly paid but desperate for work. And to give you an example, back when China first opened up their borders and invited American manufacturers in, they contacted companies like Nike that would literally be able to save 20, 30, 40% on their manufacturing costs if they moved to China. And of course, as a businessman or a corporation, being able to make a profit is your primary goal. So, a lot of these companies, they didn't think twice about it. They just jumped in with both feet. Now, over the years, there's been various and sundry issues that have occurred. One of the most famous ones back in the 90s was there was a talk show host named Kathie Lee Gifford who always talked about how much she loved her children, how much she loved children, and blah, blah, blah. And then you find out that she had a clothing line that was being manufactured by child labor. And she had to do her tour of mea culpa and apologize and promise it wouldn't happen again. Didn't stop things, though. Let's look at Apple. That's our case study for this. Apple uses a company called Foxconn to manufacture their products for Apple. Companies like Foxconn use what is called dispatch labor and student interns, which means that they are contracted employees from agencies or schools. They do not have the same rights as regular employees. To put this in the context, 20% of the Chinese urban workforce is dispatch labor or student interns, and the vast majority of these folks are working for these large manufacturing companies. In 2012, 2,000 workers from Foxconn rioted outside the plant to protest working conditions, such as they had to work longer hours than non-contracted employees. They had 12-hour shifts with just 2 30-minute breaks a day, 6 days a week. That is 72 hours a week. They had lower pay. Many of them were underage. They did not have insurance, and they were forced to work overtime up to 100 extra hours per month, but not paid any extra. So this brought worldwide attention to the conditions, and it also kind of demonstrated that Apple, despite their, idea that they are kind of the nice company out there, wasn't very nice. So how did Apple respond? Well, Tim Cook, who is the CEO of Apple, pledged to do everything possible to pressure Chinese manufacturing plants to improve their working conditions. He set a 60-hour-a-week maximum for employees. So they got a whole 12 extra hours out of their schedule removed. And he promised not to hire children anymore. Americans would not work in the conditions that Chinese manufacturers demand. And that is one of the biggest issues in terms of why you walk into Walmart and almost everything you see in Walmart is made in China. Because Americans have a higher standard of living, they have higher expectations, and as a consequence to all of this, what you begin to see is the fact that these folks, these people who are interested in, building a corporation, tend to go overseas. Now, another major component in the world is the World Bank. And the World Bank was initially developed at the end of World War II to help countries rebuild after the war. Eventually, it shifted its focus to help developing nations reduce poverty and improve living standards. And just to kind of put this in context, there are 7 billion people on Earth, and 1.2 billion live in extreme poverty. We measure extreme poverty by people who are living on less than $1 a day. And that is 1988. This is from 1998, but unfortunately it hasn't really changed too much. The vast majority of people who are living in poverty live in Southeast Asia, specifically India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. Sub-Saharan Africa is huge in terms of the poverty levels, and then East Asia and the Pacific, countries like China. You'll notice that North America we're doing pretty good. We still have poverty, but people don't live on $1 a day in this country. Now, the World Bank has been criticized because it tends to look after the interests of the more powerful countries like the U.S. And it doesn't hurt that the U.S. are the ones who generally lead the World Bank. Loan monies to ruthless totalitarian leaders more often than democratically elected leaders. And the reason for that is because they know when they're giving money to some ruthless dictator, he is not going to let it slip through his hands. He's either going to embezzle it himself or he's actually going to use it for something productive. Whereas these democratically elected leaders, they're afraid are not strong enough and that all of the money will get embezzled. It's a little bit of a funky logic there, but what can you do? And they tend to engage with the elite of struggling countries that rather than work with the grassroots organizations to help the least advantaged groups. And this again is one of those scenarios where you have folks who are desperately in need of working towards getting out of poverty. But the money that they need to help them is going to the elite, the top of the government, the top of the corporations, and not coming down to them. Back in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan ran on this idea of trickle-down economics, which is where you give all the economic benefits to the people up at the very top of the economic food chain, the millionaires, the billionaires, and that they would trickle their monies down. In other words, they would spend their money and it would come down to us middle class and poor folk. Well, over the years, it's been proven over and over and over again that trickle-down economics does not work. Just do the math. It just doesn't work. Look at the history. It doesn't work. And yet, this is still the predominant idea behind a lot of the conservative economic policies in this country. So, and then last but not least, the World Bank has fostered terrible environmental and agricultural damage. And things like a big issue that we have seen over the last 50 years is what's happened in Haiti. Now, Haiti has had terrible leadership, but they had a great natural resource, and that was trees. And over the years, the World Bank basically made it possible for industrialists to come in and cut down all of the trees. So this is what happens when you cut down all of the trees. Think about when you build a house, and you're building a house, and you're going to put in the basement, you're going to put in the outline, you're going to do all that stuff. But the house needs to be built into the ground. There has to be a base there so that the house is going to be structurally sound. Well, in dirt, you need tree roots to maintain the structural soundness of the ground. Now, you take all the trees away, what happens? You lose all that structural rebar, that natural rebar that trees provide. So when Haiti got hit by an earthquake a few years ago, it devastated the country because there was nothing holding the ground in place. And as a consequence, there are still people who are living in tents because there was just no way they could rebuild. The World Bank and crime. So the World Bank has also been accused of being complicit in genocide. They've been accused of working against the humanitarian groups in the Sudan, for example, and Rwanda. They have been accused of exacerbating ethnic conflict, especially in countries like Nigeria, increasing the gap between rich and poor by focusing on the money going to the top of the food chain, displacing indigenous people, and environmental disasters.